stream. Thing looks like it's supposed to. Alright. Now, so. Next chapter, we are finally getting into the French Revolution and Napoleon. And also, as a reminder, 2 weeks from today is the first paper, so FYI. The default topic is actually going to be covered in this chapter. It's a little bit late, but you can still do other stuff. So, if you're in person, please print it out and bring it to me if you can. If not, email it to me. For my online people, obviously email it to me. But when you email it, please attach it as a Word document or a PDF document, not a link to a Google Doc or Google Drive, because A, Francis Marion's email hates it, and B, if I have to go through and like send an email to get a message, to get a link, to even open the thing, I'm going to be like 10 emails down by the time that all happens. And that's just a lot of extra work. So, make it so that I can open it right away is what I need. Other than that, we can get into the French Revolution, unless anybody has got any questions about anything. 2 weeks from today. So, it's like March the... Let's find out. Where's my stuff? There we go, calendar. March the 11th. Because then the next week will be Francis Marion spring break. And we won't be here. At least I won't be here. Okay. So, French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, and as I say here, things do get a little nuts in France. So, let's get into that. So we've discussed these long-term causes of the French Revolution in the previous chapters. Nobility that were unhappy about eroding privileges. They wanted to turn back the clock, as it were, on the monarchs gaining all this absolutism and the modernization of the nations. The Third Estate, of course, dissatisfied with their lot. And it depended on what part of the Third Estate you were in would determine your type of dissatisfaction. Some wanted less modernization, so like peasants and artisans wanted things to be kind of go back to the way they were, whereas others wanted more rapid modernization, like the bourgeoisie. Regardless, everyone in the Third Estate felt that the first 2 estates were benefiting from all their hard work, which was definitely what was going on. Also, the Enlightenment. Again, we had an entire chapter on that. The Enlightenment gave voice to those that were dissatisfied in the way things were, gave them hope that things could perhaps change and be better. And also the American Revolution, I put that in quotes because of how I was taught about the American Revolution, where the revolution had already kind of happened and the war was just the final breaking point. But the end result of that was that the British American colonies had thrown off the royal government, with the help of the French, by the way. We don't talk about that very much. I mean, I talk about that in my American history course, but like as far as rah America, we don't also say, oh, by the way, you know, if it weren't for the French, we probably wouldn't have won it. So a lot of folks in France believe that, hey, maybe we could throw off our royal authority and be a free republic. The issue with that was they didn't have an entire ocean between them and the royal palace. It was right there in Paris. So I just have this this gentleman with George Washington here. This is an image I use a lot for that I use for my American Revolution chapter. There's a lot going on. You've got Washington back here leading the troops. You've got this guy getting his horse stabbed by a bayonet for some reason. Yeah, very dramatic, very inspiring, question mark. Anyway, so that's the stuff that's happening over the long term. But there were a lot of things that were happening in the short term that were really kindling this fire. There was a debt crisis coming out of this. Louis the 14th had been spending a ton of money, and then also bankrolled the American Revolution, which further drained the treasury, just to spite the British. 50% of the national budget was spent on loan interest alone, which is not good. We have Jacques Necker, who was one of the, he was like the finance minister for France. He suggested taxing landowners, which is to say the Second Estate, to make up the money. But in order to do this, they would have to call in the Estates General, which again is basically their parliament. And this has not happened since 1614. So this is post 1776. I guess we're getting to 1780-ish by this point. They've not called the Estates General since 1614. So if they were to call them in, they're going to be pissed. There are also two major texts that led to the revolution. One, you've got the various cashiers, de la grievance notebooks, whatever, it's French. Basically, people could speak up and say whatever I guess they were like anonymous petitions to the government to say what they believed was wrong, which wasn't very common in governments across Europe, especially absolutist governments. But more importantly, we have Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès in What is a Third Estate, which we already talked about previously. This was a central focus for debates in the Estates General. He believed each delegate should have a vote rather than each estate, because again, previously, each estate had a single vote. The first estate had a vote, the second estate had a vote, and the third estate had a vote. And when you've got 2% of the population gets one vote, 5% of the population gets one vote, and 90% of the population gets one vote, and the first two tend to vote along the same lines, that 90% is going to get left out. So with Necker's idea, or not Necker, Sieyès' idea, the people that actually had the most population, which is to say everybody else, would actually get power. Also, we just had bad natural events. Sudden harsh weather destroyed crops, froze rivers. The price of bread jumped in a country where 40% of the population were barely making enough to survive. So when you're barely making enough to be able to buy bread in the first place, and suddenly the prices of food jump because crops were being destroyed, you're going to start starving, and your children are going to start starving. and you're going to start looking for any means of fixing that, no matter how desperate. And also, and this is, apologies, getting kind of down into that, but there was a lot on this slide. The indecisiveness of Louis XVI. While all this is going on, the king was never really decisive on how to act. By the time the Estates General had convened, he had not decided on how the voting would proceed, what to do about bread prices, or if he would even listen to the Estates General at all, because he didn't have to. Again, being an absolutist monarch, he didn't have to listen to the Estates General. But typically, a king, such as his great-grandfather, Louis XIV, would have already decided whether or not he was going to listen to the Estates General before he called them in. But he just was very indecisive. Again, here we have Sieyès. This is kind of paraphrasing. The pamphlet was the Third Estate, but it's pretty clear. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been until now? Nothing. What will it become? Something, and that something caused a lot of concern for the First and Second Estate. Here we have, I guess this was Louis the 16th? Not quite as flamboyant as his great-grandfather. Didn't quite have the gams his great-grandfather did. All right. Yeah, I'm going to have to do something in there. Okay. So, Third Estate voted to call themselves a National Assembly on June 17, 1789. I will let you know when there is a date that is important, but I'm specifically putting dates here because things start happening very quickly. So, the Estates General called. The Third Estate decide that they're going to call themselves the National Assembly, which is to say they believe they are the nation. They are, which I mean they were, they're 90% of the population, more than 90% of the population. So they took Sieyès' writing to heart. June 20th, Tennis Court Oath. The National Assembly swore they would not disband until France had a constitution. So there's this whole thing with the Tennis Court Oath. They have been meeting in this, in like the council chambers of the States General. Again, basically like our modern day Congress. So they get there on June 20th, and the doors are locked. And immediately they're like, oh, they've locked us out. They're deliberating in there about what to do without us because they don't want the people to have a voice, and they just start freaking out. So they go across the street to this indoor tennis court because it's in Paris. Of course, they have bougie-ass indoor tennis courts. And use that as a meeting place and swore that they would not disband until France had a constitution, which is a big step for not constitutional monarch, an absolutist monarchy, where the king could do whatever the hell he wanted. That was basically calling for the revolution at that point. The reason the doors were locked was not because they were being locked out. It was because the council chamber was being cleaned at that time, and the custodians had locked the doors to keep people from traipsing mud around the place. So, oops. But this is considered like a major, this for the French is like their first Continental Congress, like for us here in America. Like, this is a huge, major step for them. So Louis did agree to some proposals. some reforms. Didn't really do anything about the system of privileges because you can't just like dismantle the estates. That's been a thing since literally the Middle Ages. The National Assembly rejected it. So Louis the 16th was like, all right, well, I'm just going to send you guys home, whether you like it or not. And by that, he called in the Parisian Royal Guard. The French Guard, however, refused to disband the Estates General. Now, this is another major step. This is, I have this little thing here. This is a major step in a revolution. Ask Russia. Russia had a lot of almost revolutions leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution. And the reason the Bolshevik Revolution happened was because the soldiers were on the side of the people. If the soldiers are on the side of the government and shooting into crowds of civilians, there's not a whole lot you can do. But if they're now working with the people against the government's out of luck. So July 11th, so again, we're just a week or two later. Louis dismissed Necker, trying to get an anti-reformist cabinet, which the revolutionaries did not approve of, and thus started a riot, which led to July 14th, 1789, which is an important date. This is Bastille Day. So the crowd, including the soldiers who had joined them, stormed the Bastille, which was a prison and arsenal in the middle of the city. This was meant to be a major political and really almost propaganda blow to the government, because they believed that the Bastille held all sorts of political prisoners. It didn't. The Bastille mostly held like people who had been pulled off the street for drunk, disorderly conduct and were being kept in a cell to sleep it off. They didn't really free anybody important. But much like with the Declaration of Independence, it was considered a big symbolic victory, and that's the big day for the French. July 14th, 1789 is their, what we would say July 4th. That's their day, is July 14th. This also led to a bunch of officials being killed and decapitated because the French just got to go that extra step. Louis started making concessions, and the Marquis de Lafayette was made head of the National Guard. Lafayette, for those of you that have had my American history course, he was like a major figure in the American Revolution. He, I would argue, was right up there with Washington in terms of importance in winning that war. So he's back in France, now leading the National Guard on the side of the revolutionaries. So yeah, a lot happened really quickly. Yeah, a month. I mean, from June 17th to July 14th, that's not even a full month. Yeah, and not that this was the end, not that it was Bastille Day and it's over, but Bastille Day was like the big turning point from the Estates General being like, oh, we're going to be the National Assembly now, to we're going to go through the streets and like murder officials. And again, if you need a quick reminder on the three estates, there you go. Here we have the tennis court oath. Very dramatic, very, this is this huge, I mean, the light coming in the window and these flowing curtains and the way this is done, it's very like ordained by God, the way that it's portrayed. But that said, here in the middle, where's my mouse? Here in the middle, you do have all three estates. You have the first, and this is clearly a clergyman. You have the first estate. You have a man in pretty decent garb. I would argue this was probably second estate. Maybe bourgeoisie, but probably meant to be second estate. And then a third estate man in the back. So this is, the tennis court oath was still meant to be the people, as in everyone, including the first and second estates, against the monarchy. We weren't yet murdering the clergy and nobility. This is Necker, by the way. We talk about him a little bit, but he's mostly important because his dismissal was what caused all this. Here is the Bastille. Again, it was just like a medieval prison / arsenal in the middle of the city, and they attacked it and broke the people out. And it wasn't full of political prisoners like it was supposed to be. It was just like a bunch of drunks and people that were just like pulled off the street for disorderly conduct, like just really minor stuff. I mean, I imagine this like the prison in Mayberry in Danny Griffith's show. It's just like, oh, you get put in the jail cell to sleep off being drunk, so that you don't walk into the middle of the street. This is actually from a later revolution because France has multiple revolutions. But same idea, they're storming the streets, they start pulling up the paving stones and creating barricades. They barricade Paris so many times throughout history, including like relatively recently. Anyway, here's Bastille Day in Paris. More recently, Parisians still hate the Eiffel Tower. It was supposed to be like a temporary thing during a world fair, and they never took it down because it's became like a symbol of Paris, and so they didn't want to get rid of it. But the people in Paris don't like it because it's seen as gaudy. I don't know. Parisians. And there's the parade down, I don't know what the name of the street is, but that's the Arc de Triomphe from like Roman times. So, a lot of stuff. All right. Now, despite the fact that we're talking about like people getting decapitated in the streets, we are still in the moderate revolution. Things are still pretty chill. Yes. Even though we start with the Great Fear, which was due to the hunger and Louis allowing some concessions, peasants in the countryside started sacking manor houses and taking grain. There were reports of attacks on nobility, which is to say, like, roasting them alive in their front lawns. The normal stuff. So many of the first and second estates started fleeing the country, hoping to later return and reverse the revolution, which lead to problems down the road. But for them, it's like, okay, Paris, France is dangerous for us right now. Let's leave and gather support in other countries and come back and like turn this whole thing around. So we have the August Decrees, which were dismantling the system of legal privileges, which is to say the estates are legally gone now. The first and second and third estate are no longer a thing. Everyone's taxed equally. Offices are not sold. Tithe was abolished because back then the tithe was just another tax. You didn't go to church and give tithe because you felt like it. It was just another tax that you paid because the church and the government were pretty much inseparable. The Declaration of the Rights of Man were basically the August Decrees but put into writing is the easiest way to describe it. Declaration of Rights of Man, of the Rights of Man, was just these ideas that they had brought together in the August Decrees, written down and signed by Louis XVI, which is kind of, sort of their constitution, but not exactly. Again, a lot happens, but this is the breaking down of these legal privileges for the First and Second Estate. Now, after all this, Louis is tired. He's tired of all this crap, so he goes home. He goes back to Versailles to relax. However, the government, not even the government, the whole country is still in horrendous debt, and bread prices are too high for people to be able to afford. So a large group of women marched to Versailles, accompanied by the National Guard, to force his ass to come back to Paris. Apparently, Louis' guards were nervous and tried to fight the people off. The National Guard killed 2 of them, and Louis was forced to return to Paris. Which I will show you an image here in a moment of this march of women to Versailles, and it's no wonder that the only casualties in this were 2 of Louis' guards. So during this time period, there were a lot of clubs that came about, these groups that came together. Basically, imagine the salons we talked about in the Enlightenment era, where people would come together and discuss ideas that were counter to what the government would allow. This is more open and radical. The Jacobin Club was one such group that was more about policy and ideas. We'll talk about another group in a little bit that was more about breaking people's legs. A member of the Jacobins was Maximilien Robespierre, who is going to be extremely important. I would argue probably the most important individual in the revolution until we get to Napoleon. So to deal with the debt crisis, the National Assembly seized church property to, sell and make money off of, because church property couldn't be taxed, and if you seize church property, you could then tax it. This happened around the same time as France issuing its first national paper currency, the assignat. However, paper currency, especially back then, was not trusted, because, to put it simply, paper currency has no worth. If you have a $1 bill and a $1,000 bill, they're not intrinsically worth anything more than the paper they're made out of. You can go to a bank or, obviously a store, and it be worth more, but it's not actually worth any more than, one's not worth any more than the other. Not really. They're just paper. But if you have a silver coin that's got $1 worth of silver in it, and a gold coin worth $50 of gold, that's what they are. They're physically there in your hands. You have $1 worth of silver or $50 worth of gold in your hand. And that's what people have been used to up to this point. So paper money that was worth, we promise this is worth money somewhere in a bank that you can't see right now, people didn't trust that. So the paper money quickly lost value. Here is the Women's March on Versailles. They were ready. They were dragging a cannon. They had weapons. I mean, most of these are like farm implements. You've got some pikes, some axes. That lady's got a scythe. This one's got a damn halberd. I saw one, I remember. Yeah, you've got some like sabers and stuff. They were ready to go. So here we have Robespierre. I found a lot of these like historical quotes when I was putting these together. The secret of freedom lies in educating people, whereas the secret of tyranny is in keeping them ignorant. And I'm not going to say too much about that, just that that should be remembered. Just, in general. Another one for Robespierre. To punish the oppressors of humanity is clemency, to forgive them is cruelty. So Robespierre was very much on board with what's going to happen to the king, as well as a lot of people. So, some reactions to this. The church was obviously not happy. They had land being taken from them. The clerics had no income. So the National Assembly decided that they weren't just going to leave these people out in the cold. They suggested the civil constitution of the clergy, where the clergy would swear loyalty to the state and then receive a pension. They will become state employees, basically. About 54% of clerics agreed. The others were eventually imprisoned or exiled, because if you don't swear allegiance to the state, you are seen as a potential traitor and therefore a danger to the state. The revolution got scary fast. And we're still in the moderate revolution. While this was going on, Louis remained king. And just like with what we saw at the start, his stance on things was dependent on the day. Sometimes he would let the assembly make decisions. Sometimes he refused to work with them. He would use his veto power to stall. Meanwhile, clerics and nobility would flee the country. And many in the assembly were concerned that he was keeping ties with them and preparing for the impending invasion to take out the revolution. So in the summer of 1791, Louis made a decision. He tried to flee France. However, this didn't go so well. And when this failed, Jacobus used this to prove the king could not be trusted and had to be gotten rid of, which we'll talk about in a moment. The thing about the king fleeing France, prior to this, unless you lived in Paris or worked within the palace, you didn't really, the common man often didn't know what their king looked like. Because, this was, we're barely out of the Middle Ages. However, paper currency has just been introduced. So everybody is being forced to carry these bills. What do you think was plastered on these bills? What's on the front of our money? Yeah, so what do you think was on the front of their money? The king. So everybody knew what the king looked like. So when he was trying to escape, he was doing so incognito. He was trying to, disguise himself in a carriage escaping, and they were like, oh wait, this guy looks like the guy on the money. He's not supposed to be here. And they stopped him, and he got caught and brought back to Paris. I really like this image because mostly of whatever is happening with this horse. Look at his tiny head and his chunky body. Like this isn't a medieval drawing. This is late 1700s. Why does the horse look like that? I just showed you guys a painting of a horse. What's that? Yes. Yes. Yes.
They don't know what a lion looks like, so they wrap the pelt around like a spear.
Yeah. Just figured it out.
It just looks like an eldritch creature. It doesn't look like a lion.
They should know what a horse looks like. But I guess they didn't. I mean, I guess. So, now things are getting more dangerous. So, on the second anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, which again is their big day, Louis XVI signed the Constitution. However, he would still not behave. He supported revolutionary violence in the Vendée, which is a big region of southern France, which the book mentions. Let's see. Oh, it doesn't. Okay, yeah, just says a outbreak of counter-revolutionary violence in Vendée. And an Austria-Prussian alliance that intended to come in and restore the French monarchy. Now, for the most part, he didn't do anything too overt. He did use his veto power to slow things down. However, rumors continued to spread that he was plotting with these outside forces to overthrow the revolution. Which, I don't know if he was plotting with them, but he certainly would have been more than happy with them coming in and putting him back where he wanted to be. So another group, this is the other group I mentioned, these sans-culottes. They were groups of workers who pressured the assembly when Les Chapeliers passed a law that forbade unions and strikers after the guilds were abolished. Basically, this was the group that, rather than work with rhetoric, they threatened mob violence. Oh, you don't want to give us, the ability to form unions and go on strike? Cool. Sure will be a shame if your house burned down. Also, their name comes, sans-culottes means basically without tights. They wore long workman's pants as opposed to like shorter pants and then tights the rest of the way down, like to use modern day parlance, like white collar workers would wear more frilly pants and then stockings the rest of the way down, whereas these blue collar workers, these sans-culottes, would just wear working pants, and therefore they stood out. So then we have the wars. Beginning in April of 1792, Assembly declared war on Austria because they believed that these émigrés, which are the people who have been leaving France to potentially come back and retake it, were a threat to the revolution. And as things often go with France, very, very soon after declaring war, the enemy was deep within French territory. and demanded the safety of the royal family. So the revolutionaries responded by attacking the royal palace. So the king and his family had to seek protection with the assembly that he had been butting heads with this whole time. So the assembly locked the royal family in a medieval fortress and abolished itself, ordering elections for France's First Republic while they're being invaded. Which, like, cool, but also you've got stuff going on. Kind of a rough time to have an election. So we have the Sans-Culottes. They're pointing and laughing at this guy who's wearing tights because he's not a blue-collar worker. I like the idea that this guy down here is passed out on the table from drinking too much, because you can see bottles of wine laying around. Yeah, they drank a lot. All right, is this? Yes. I really went all out with this particular PowerPoint. It's really big when I went to bring it up. So, yeah. September 2nd, there were rumors that the fortress in Verdun had fallen. Radicals panicked and began attacking the prisons, slaughtering between 1,100 and 1,400 traitors to the revolution, which are mostly priests and nuns. Which, again, were already in prison. They were pulling these people out of prisons and murdering them because they believed that they were traitors to the revolution. The rumors that the fortress had fallen were false, so this happened for no reason. So we've got about 1,500 people murdered for no reason. Great. September 22nd. Louis was stripped of the throne. The Republic was created. A vote was conducted on universal manhood suffrage, which is to say all men could vote. Now, while we technically had some level of manhood suffrage here in America, it was not universal. You had to own a certain level of property before you could vote. The poor could not vote in the United States. Here, as long as you were a man, you could vote. Now, that said, of course, women were excluded because it's still the 1700s, but there was no property qualification on the voting like there was in other nations that had voting. So, the convention was this new governmental body that was elected. Immediately after this, new grain riots and other violent protests, which are often caused by these radical groups, erupted across Paris because they felt that they hadn't gone far enough. They still needed to push the revolution further. Within the convention, there were two factions: the Montagnards and the Girondins, whatever is French. So, the Montagnard, the naming is mostly from where they're from in France, but also the Mountain Club, as they were called, were largely the radicals that were led by the Courtiers and Jacobins that sat on the higher end of the room because the floor was uneven, because again, it's an old building. Even back then it was an old building. And so the one side of the room was higher than the other. And it was on the left-hand side of the chamber. Whereas the Girondins were from southern France, known as the Gironde, were more moderate, and while they agreed to the king's treason, they opposed his execution. Then they tended to sit on the right-hand side of the chamber floor. This is literally where we get the left and right political spectrum from, because of where these assholes sat 200 years ago. Because the guys that were more radical and pushing for more change were sitting on the left, and the ones that were more conservative and were trying to keep things the way they were sitting on the right. That's literally where this comes from. That said, the ones that were not on board with the revolution being as dramatic as it was, soon came under suspicion, and many faced execution as the years went on. No one was safe in France. So here we have the September massacres. Again, priests and nuns being just dragged out of prisons and slaughtered in the streets. Now, what does one do with a king that has been fighting against the revolution this whole time? What do you do with a king that has been resisting the progress of the revolution? It's France. You kill the king. Yeah. Now, there was a majority vote that the king had indeed committed treason. Now, that said, there is a lot of evidence that many of these votes were pressured by the more radical members themselves, threatening violence against those that would have voted against this. The actual vote for the king's execution was 361 to 360. Should also mention that if I remember right, the first time this vote was done, the king was not voted to be executed. So they sent everybody home and then brought the ones back that had voted for the king to be executed and then had the vote again. And it still didn't quite pass. So they sent them home and brought the ones back. So it was smaller and smaller each time. And it still barely passed. Because, like, hey, executing the king, even for the French, was kind of a big deal. Granted, they had just done that in England. But this was still, regicide was kind of a pretty big step. That said, the king's execution was conducted with a new enlightened invention, the guillotine. This was invented by a Dr. Guillotine, kick-ass last name. Obviously, it wouldn't have meant anything back then until he created the device, but now it's, yeah. This was designed to minimize the suffering that often accompanied executions, because there are only so many ways you could execute somebody. Obviously, hanging, that could still go wrong. The way it's supposed to work is you drop the platform out from under the person and they fall and it breaks their neck. If it doesn't work, they're slowly strangled to death, which is not a pretty way to go. Most royal executions would be the headsman's axe, where the guy just chops the person's head off. Very Skyrim opening. But a lot of things can go wrong there. For one, the headsman can miss and hit the back of your head. That won't kill you, but it will hurt a lot. And then he's got to reset while you're bleeding out to cut your neck. And because the point of an execution isn't to cause pain. It's to quickly end the person's life and move on. If you're chopping into the back of their skull, you're failing at your job. Also, especially as things went on, sometimes the axe would start getting dull, and you'd go through and you need 2 or 3 swipes to take the head off. Yeah, and so that's going to be horrific. So with this, at least, it's all, the blade is in like a track. The person's head is, put in the little thing, and it's angled in such a way that it cuts as efficiently as possible, takes the head off, everything's fine. Probably. Okay, it just reset on mine. Why? What? No, you don't. The hell just happened? Alright, hold on. Try that again. Okay. Yeah, I dealt with that a lot teaching at Tri-County Tech. They had a lot of, they were updating my last year or two there. They didn't know that people could still feel pain, because when you take the head off, the head, you don't have time to ask questions. We kind of know that now because you can put devices in and get the neural, the neurons firing and whatnot. But this was still better than what they'd had up to this point. This wasn't burning at a stake or crushing with stones or drowning in a river with the freaking witch trials. What's that? Yeah, roasting alive. The point of this was not pain. It was just to quickly get it done. So, oh yeah. Yes. Yep.
Because you don't feel anything else except for that drop of water on your forehead. And they don't feed you or they don't give you water. It's on your forehead, so you can't even drink the water. You slowly thirst for that as water. You can't go to sleep either because the water just drops on your forehead.
Yep. That one I'm not heard of. So, after Louis was killed, England joined in because England, any reason to fight France, but also they're going to be really hypocritical and be like, oh, how dare France, how dare France kill their king? We have to join in and get rid of this despotic regime. It's like, England? Remember Charles the First? Was that not? No? Okay. Yeah. So, England's joining in because they killed their king. So the convention conscripted 300,000 men into their army, which back then was huge. That's an insane number of people being pulled into the army. However, having your door kicked down and being dragged off to join the army had a lot of people running away from that, roaming into the countryside as brigands, which meant that France had just as many internal enemies as it had external. So France was not only dealing with Austria and England, and I guess Spain wasn't really doing anything. And Prussia, right? Prussia was also there. All these external nations going to war with them. They also had literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of bandits just roaming around France. So we have one of my favorite groups, simply due to the sheer ridiculousness of their name, the Committee of Public Safety. So the Committee of Public Safety chose the members of the Revolutionary Tribunal, which the tribunal itself would try people that were accused of political crimes. This was typically the group that sent people to the guillotine. So the Committee of Public Safety created the group that sent people to the guillotine. The only other group I've seen that has this hilarious of a name was the Irish Friendly Farmers Committee or Alliance or something. They were terrorists that would just like burn down British checkpoints and whatnot. Good stuff. We had the Levée en Masse in the summer of 1793, which was a general draft. That's horrifying. Every able-bodied man that was not married was pulled into the army. The army was swelled to 1.2 million, which also meant that, more and more people were running to the countryside to become bandits because they didn't want to join the army. Because joining the army is a quick way to an awful death. Here's Louis. People gathering around to watch. There's his head. They cut the head off and then they hold it up by the hair to show everyone that he's very much dead. I feel like I've got another. Yeah, so there we have the way the guillotine worked. Again, it was at an angle, so it wouldn't even like hit all at once. Because if the blade hit it once, it's a lot of surface area, and that could potentially stop, which you don't want. So if it hits like at an angle, it's slicing only a part at a time, and therefore it's happening so fast. Again, you're not really going to feel it, but it's as efficient as possible. So when I was putting this together, again, like 2014, 2015, when I was putting this together, they had like the 10-year challenge on Facebook, I think, and I found this picture and had to include it. Marie Antoinette was also executed along with the king. All right, let's go a little further before we finish today, because this is a long chapter. Because this is the French Revolution and Napoleon in the same chapter. It's too much. Too much French. So we have the Reign of Terror, because, yeah, more of that. A series of laws put together in September of 1793 to strengthen the Republic by basically getting rid of everybody else. Law of suspects. Anyone suspected of opposing or who may eventually oppose the revolution was arrested and put on trial. So if you were in a position that you could potentially cause trouble for the revolution, you were arrested and put on trial. Like, this is Minority Report shit of like, you might cause trouble in the future, so we're going to go ahead and arrest you. Therefore, every remaining member of clergy and aristocracy was now in danger of being arrested. That said, not all of them made it to jail, because lynch mobs often would find them themselves and hang them from lampposts. which, as I said, that's not a great way to go. Being hung from a lamppost is different from being hung at a, I guess hanged is the correct term, at a gallows. Because you're just having a rope tied around your neck and slowly lifted up to the lamppost, and you are being strangled with your arms and usually your legs also tied. It's not a good way to go. It'd be better to get caught by the royal police and rot in jail or be executed than be dragged through the street and pulled up on a lamppost. We also have the general maximum. Anyone selling bread above a set price or hoarding grain was considered traitors to the republic and therefore also sent to jail. So this kept the guillotines very busy. But between September 1793 and July 1794, 16,000 people died by the blade of the guillotine. And another 12,000 people died in prison without even going to trial. Because again, this is the 1700s, and prisons aren't safe. You're just going to die of disease in prison. Again, to go back to my American history real quick, more American soldiers died in British prisons than died on battlefields. Because that's just how the prisons were. It's not that they were specifically like they weren't like concentration camps where they were made to kill the people. They were, when you have a bunch of people in a small space and it's the 1700s and you only know so much about like germ theory, which is to say none, people are going to get sick and die in large numbers. Yes, the miasma, yeah, the bad air. The Civil Wars made things significantly worse. 200,000 people were killed in the Vendée alone, which again, the Vendée is just like a region of France. So we had people being put on trial and executed for France is at war with England, Austria, and Prussia. So most of the great powers. They've got brigands roaming around, murdering people at random, and they have civil wars going on that's killing almost as many people as we had in our Civil War. And this is just like a part of what's going on. It's a wonder France survived. And it's an even bigger wonder that France ended up becoming like as powerful as it was under Napoleon, that they had anything left. But yeah, it was rough. I mean, they were running guillotines all day long. Here we have, this one's a bit more modern. You can see by what they're wearing. But they were always public spectacles. And now I just decided to throw this in. The old way of doing things. Anyway, let's see. Before I let you guys go, because the next part is the Revolution Beyond France, and there's a lot of cool stuff to talk about there, so I'll wait for next time. Can either of you guess when the last time the guillotine was used to execute a criminal in France? Mm-hmm. It's horrifyingly recent. Not that recent. Yeah, it was prior to 2000. You're close. I need to find I can't remember the exact year. It was the year before Star Wars Episode 4 came out. which I think was 70. I think it was 76 or 78. It was in the mid to late 70s. You could probably find it quicker than me. 78. (1977). So it was in 76. 1976, they used the guillotine in France for the last time to execute somebody. Yeah, they didn't abolish it until later, but they yeah, we probably shouldn't use it anymore. Oh yeah, we still execute people. Yeah. We have people running on the death penalty, like, oh, we're gonna make the death penalty happen more. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure we do. If we don't, I know we got people running on reintroducing it. Typically lethal injection, yeah. I don't think we use the electric chair anymore. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Hey man, the French are crazy. Let's see. Here we go. Death penalty states. 27 states allow capital punishment. Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, California. That's a surprise. Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi. Blah blah blah. South Carolina. Yep. Yep. Not a surprise. Oh, it is very, very red. 27. So more than half of the states, slightly more than half of the states have it. All right, that'll do. I'll see y'all on Monday. I will get well, we're not that much through this PowerPoint yet, so I'll get it up next time. But for you online folks, I'll get the video up, and I'll see y'all next time. You would think that more Americans would like the French, considering how much they did for us in the Revolutionary War. I think a lot of it is due to Vietnam. We got into Vietnam because of the French. They were there first, and then they were pulling out, and we were like, we can't let communism win, so we went in and took over for the French. And then also, well, the French have always hated us, but America hating the French, I think, is a more recent thing. I mean, the French hate the